Este episodio es patrocinado por Fronius.
Fronius Solar Energy. Energize your life.
Hi everyone, this is the first episode that we're going to have in full in English. It's the first time. I'm very excited. I'm now with Kellie Mc Phearson. Kellie Mc Phearson, it's an executive vice president of compliance and risk, NERC and for compliance for renewable energy assets at Radiant Generation. So thank you so much. I'm very excited.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's so great, and thank you for hosting us here in Guadalajara.
Thank you so much, Kellie. You have a lot of experience. You have a very great backgrounds related with compliance. Can you give us a description who you are, what you have been doing during this period?
Yeah, well, I'm really fortunate. I come from I have a really interesting background. My dad was a system operator at Southern California Edison as a kid, and I used to go to work with him in the control center. This was back before cybersecurity, restricted who could go in a control center. And I will date myself here. I don't know if you guys we had the Richter scale and they had the dot matrix printer, and I would go and he'd send me over there to go grab the printout for him. And so I was really lucky. I got to go to work with my dad. When I was in my 9th grade of starting high school, my dad, California deregulated the power market. Yeah. And so my dad actually went and was one of the first shift supervisors at the California Independent System Operators. We moved from Southern California to Northern California. So my background here in the energy industry started from, really from day one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I interned at the California ISO, and then I went off to college and I did a bunch of other things. And when I was 26, my dad told me that I needed to get a real job and I needed to come work for him. And while I was doing college and all of that, my dad became an expert in NERC compliance. So in 2007, FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, actually passed a section of the Federal Power Act that required entities to actually be compliant with standards. And so my dad became an expert in those standards, had his own consulting firm, and he asked me to come and work for him for a few years. And so I worked with my dad for several years, and then in 2013, I got a phone call from a renewable developer who said, "We've got all these solar farms and we think they're going to need to be compliant with the NERC standards. Can you help us? We don't know what any of that means, but we need help." And so I made the transition over to renewable energy in 2013 and started figuring out how to get solar sites to be compliant with all these new standards. And so NERC is actually North American Electric Reliability Corporation, used to be Council Corporation, and they're responsible for actually enacting all these standards and then figuring out how to enforce compliance. And so I figured out how to make solar compliant with those standards. I helped support registering one of the first solar sites in 2014. So, and it's been on a growth trajectory like crazy. So I joined Radiant Generation in 2019. Radiant started in 2013. The founders really had this vision that if the United States is really going to do renewable energy, we're really going to make an impact in the environment, that we really had to take care of these assets. Folks were so focused on how do you build them, get them built, what's the financial impact and all that, and just get to commercial operations, but they never had any, how do you fulfill on the promise of actually delivering renewable energy? No one was thinking about it. So the founders of Radiant Gen in 2013 founded the company to do asset management, to really manage these assets and make sure they fulfilled their promise, that they were operated well, that they were financially responsible, all the things. I joined in 2019 because they realized that compliance with NERC standards was really complementary to that and really, really important. Over the last 4 years, we've built an incredible team. We've expanded hugely. We have folks in India and folks here in Mexico and all across the U.S. that are working to ensure that all these renewable assets are compliant.
Awesome. It's a very, very interesting history and background. It's too much.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. You are really an expert in this topic. But what I want to ask you is, you mentioned about compliance, but what we should understand about compliance?
Yeah.
I mean, which are the main like objectives that compliance is pursuing?
Yeah, and the real reason that the federal government, that FERC, said we needed to have these standards and requirements because we had this series of events that happened on the grid that caused problems. That were unreliable. It's interesting. There's many different events that you can point to, starting in 1968 and kind of going forward. There's this whole history, but in my mind, the expression, the straw that broke the camel's back, like the big thing that happened was back in 2005. There was in 2003 there was a blackout in the Northeast. So Boston, New York, like the whole Eastern Seaboard, had a 3-day blackout in the middle of August. And it was record heat temperature. So 118 degrees in New York City. Can you imagine that? People don't run their air conditioner. It's just they don't see that type of heat like that. And so there was a lot of unfortunately fatalities, things like that. And so the federal government said, the grid is not reliable. We're disjointed. We have these 3 different interconnections between the Western, the Eastern, and then the ERCOT interconnections. And no one's minding, transmission and the interconnectedness. And the world's continuing to grow. We're starting to see at that time, the Internet of Things, we're so connected, but nobody was minding the electrical grid. So NERC was really established to put these standards and policies together so everybody has to rise to the same requirement to ensure reliability on the grid. So at the end of the day, the most important thing about NERC compliance is ensuring reliability. Yeah. And we really believe, the biggest pushback we have in the United States right now around renewables is folks think that renewables are not reliable.
Yeah.
But I will argue to the grave that I think NERC compliance is the biggest trump card when it comes to the reliability argument. Because the solar farm down the street from the coal plant has to follow the same exact NERC standards, as their neighbor on the grid. And I think to be able to show that solar, wind, battery, all of these projects are following all of the standards and requirements says a lot about reliability.
That's very, very interesting because I want to ask you, here in Mexico, for example, we are speaking about the variability of these renewable resources and how it affects the reliability and the operation in general in the grid. But how it's NERC dealing with storage? Because it's storage, in my opinion, it's something that it's going to make possible to have this big amount of renewable energy assets working at the same time with the regular sources or generation. So what do you think? It's relevant? It's going to play a very...
It's absolutely relevant. And I think the really cool part about batteries and what I love about storage is that it lends further to the idea that renewables are reliable. So, we work with some battery sites. They're out in North Carolina, and they discharge from, this is so interesting to me. They discharge from 3:15 a.m. to 7:45 a.m. every single morning because that's where the grid had a hole. They didn't have the generation to fill it. Yeah. And now those batteries are actually truly impacting and making the grid more reliable. So instead of having this dip in the in the generation availability and
this duck curve or something,
yes,
right?
Well, a little bit different, but yes, the duck curve definitely in California for sure. But we're closing the gap on the curve, right?
Absolutely.
We're fixing that liability that we had, and so I love the idea of having a solar or wind site coupled with batteries, and now we've created a 24/7 viable generation, participant on the grid. And what's different about that and what is so dynamic is, in California for so long, so like when I was growing up, my dad was working in Southern California Edison, and they're looking at the projections like, oh, we're going to be low, we're not going to meet the generation requirements. We need capacity on the grid. We need to push megawatts. They're picking up the phone and they're calling CDW or the California Department of Water Resources. They're calling up the pumped hydro facility and they're saying, can you dump water? We need generation. Mm-hmm. Now that we have batteries and the ability to discharge batteries and to charge them and all of that, now those battery sites, they just became the exact same thing as that pumped hydro. We actually serve the grid better with battery battery storage.
Yeah, and it's different market because now you have like this self-use of this energy, but you can provide these ancillary services as well, reserves as well.
Yes.
So
and the other thing that's really interesting, I'm curious, I think let's talk about this again in 6-9 months to better understand, but with batteries we actually have the ability to provide auxiliary power too. You could be a black start resource, and that's a really important thing, and that's a separate market, and that's a separate megawatt. There's additional value on a black start resource, which is pretty cool to be able to be part of the restoration of your grid. So there's a great big huge grid outage, and you're gonna get people power back in their homes. That's pretty awesome.
yeah, absolutely.
Security.
Yeah, I want to ask you about cybersecurity because nowadays it's like a real threat. It's a real threat, and perhaps a lot of assets are not considering that. You mentioned something of this in your podcast, that they have also this password just pasted very close to the server or things like that. How relevant is to manage properly cybersecurity?
Oh my gosh, it's of utmost importance, and I think we talk about grid reliability. And part of reliability is not only capacity and the ability to meet the energy capacity needs in the United States, but also to make sure that these assets are secure. And in this application, this applies to all energy assets across the world, right? Yeah. Energy is so important. We need it for so many different things. And on the cybersecurity side, it's really sometimes to me it's just it's defeating because it feels like there's so many small, inexpensive things that folks can do to ensure that these sites are secure from a cyber perspective. Looking at that is so important. And so we had a site actually that we did a test around. We did some pen testing, and we were able to prove that through the LinkedIn password, a vulnerability that was exposed. We had, white hat hackers were actually able to hack all the way through to the power plant and put their cursor over the breaker. And what that does is that proves that if you're not locking down these renewable assets that are power plants, we're going to have a problem. So
it's a huge threat.
Yeah. And so access management, who's on your site, knowing who's on your site, making sure that they're approved and they should be there, and you're not just having admin accounts and extra things is really, really important. Password management, change management, and then patching. I can't tell you how many sites we have, that are deploying new sites, and the Windows updates are, completely out of, are not current, and their firewall licenses, are expired. These are simple things that are not a lot of money that people can go and do and make a huge impact to cybersecurity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have just a couple of final questions. The first one is, how complex is for these entities to have this, to be compliant, to have this registration and then be compliant?
I mean, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of, a lot of considerations. If you think about kind of the typical solar site that we're working on in the United States, take that for example, on our megawatt site, they're gonna their registration, their compliance is gonna be, between 30 and 40, standards they have to be compliant with. But of those standards, many of them might not be applicable to the site. I like to say this, I think it's really important. There's no secret sauce to NERC compliance. It's really just a matter of being diligent, having a plan and executing on the plan and getting your documentation together. And it's a rinse repeat process. And that's what my team does every day for their clients. We have a lot of clients that are foreign investors, IPPs, they have other things that they're doing, and so they're happy to outsource to our team to be the experts for them and run that program.
Thank you so much. My last question is how Radian can help these customers to be compliant.
Oh gosh, yeah, I think Radian, it's just amazing what our team is doing. Your team supporting technical asset management, making sure that these sites are operating, that we are reliable, that we're standing up to the promise that renewable assets will change the electrical industry. Radian is passionate about making that change. We want to be the best, and we want to make sure that we want renewable energy to be the best. We want them to be successful. We want to impact climate change, and we do that every day through making sure that these assets are run, with accountability and run well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It was a very exciting episode. So thank you so much, and see you next time.
Thank you.